Now, what I'm going to draw from today, probably what you could just listen to the video by itself, or if you want to have stuff up to follow along with me, you're probably going to want to go to the websites, argenheimer.com/foundations, or just go to argenheimer and then click on AP Psychology, drag down to Foundations. That'll bring you here. Here's these 2 Quizlet decks, which is what it used to be 14 units, and they've consolidated it to 9. So Foundations now is made up of what used to be Unit 1 and Unit 2. And then I'm going to be also going through a couple of the tests that I give regular psychology, just to kind of give examples. But we're going to try and do this real quick. By the way, the College Board recommends doing what we're doing today, Unit 1, in 14 to 16 days. We're going to do this in about 30 or maybe even 40 minutes, but it's going to be really quick. I'm going to try and go real fast, especially over the stuff that I don't think is going to be likely to be on the exam. But I'll try and emphasize the stuff that I think is more likely to be on the exam. So this will be much more of a review rather than going over it the first time. But everyone that's listening to this has already had this unit. It's just been a while, so. So this will be a review, a very, very fast review. First of all, this is, everyone that's had this class has seen me draw. Let me move my body over here. Everyone that's had this class has seen this graphic drawn on the board. I really don't think this, like the people, are going to be on the AP test, especially not this year with as little as they have. It's going to be overarching themes. But that being said, I want to spend maybe 2 minutes on going over the history of psychology. Today, we're going to break it down into basically 3 categories. One is history, which is all this stuff at the top here, which I think is relatively non-important. 2 is approaches, which is very important. And that is the overarching approaches to psychology, which would be structuralism, functionalism, which are 2 dead approaches, but especially behavioralism, psychoanalysis or psychodynamic theory, humanistic theory, behavioral theory, cognitive, things like that. That's going to be very important, and there very likely could be a question about that on the AP test. And then the other part of Unit 1 is research methods, which is also very important. So let's just go real quick over the history of psychology, which is going to be the exact thing we did in class. Okay, so a long, long time ago, 400 BC, we had Socrates and Plato. They came up with a bunch of stuff. This is when psychology was, and again, I'm going to be going very fast and glossing over a whole bunch of stuff, but I'll try and go in depth in the stuff that I think is important. And again, we've also already talked about this. Socrates and Plato, 2 philosophers that are kind of pre-psychologists that talked about some things like dualism and monism. Dualism, that the brain and the body, or the mind and the body are separate, and monism, they're the same. Monism is more in line with Catholic theology. Dualism says once you die, then the other way around. Dualism is more in line with Catholic theology. Your mind and body are 2 distinct entities. Monism would be it's all the same. Once you die, that's it. Aristotle disagreed. Then we go like 2,000 years. A bunch of things happened. Descartes, not that important for the AP test. Empiricism is the beginning of basically the scientific method. He said that evidence is important. Wundt is the first psychology lab, which was extremely rudimentary and dropped a ball and measured the reaction time of dropping the ball consciously versus do it as fast as you can. Let's move on to approaches, which I think is more important. The first, and I don't even think this is going to be on the AP test until we get to modern theories, but the first approach was structuralism and functionalism, and both in the 1890s. And they're both dead fields. No one believes them anymore. But structuralism is used introspection by Edward Titchener, and that was an extremely focused method where you describe the most basic elements of an object or a behavior. So like when you're looking at the behavior of jealousy or whatever, or a chair that holds you up or anything, then you look at the most basic pieces that make that up. Like a chair, you could say a chair's purpose is to hold you up, but that wouldn't be structuralism. Structuralism would be what the chair's texture is, and what the chair's viscosity is, and what the chair's exact light refraction is, and what the chair's color is, multiple colors, all that stuff. Functionalists, this is a theme of each of the approaches, is that each new approach came and said to the old approaches, yeah, that's a dumb way of doing things. We're going to do things a better way. That's what basically every approach did. is the behaviorist said to the psychoanalyst, "That's dumb, and we're going to do it a better way." And then the humanist said, "Well, that's bad in some ways. We're going to do it a better way." But the functionalists disagree with the structuralists, and they did things in it makes sense, functional way. So they said it's dumb to look like break apart the individual pieces of a chair. It's more important to look at how a chair functions. Of course, they didn't care about a chair. They cared about more mental processes and things like that. But how the concept of jealousy, how is that actually adaptive, and why is that a useful trait for humans? But I don't think either of these are going to be on hardly any AP test. I don't think they've really ever been featured on an AP test ever. So let's get on to the stuff that actually matters. And that would be the actual fields of psychology. So behaviorism, I have BX as a shorthand for behavior. Shouldn't have written that, but I did. Behaviorism is the scientific study of observable behavior. Let me actually skip, because psychoanalysis was before that. So in the 1900s, actually a little bit before the 1900s, Sigmund Freud came out, and Freud kind of put psychology on the map in terms of pop culture and making it popular. But Freud's main thing, as we've talked about, was the unconscious. So he said the unconscious is the most important thing. And he started the field of psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis and psychodynamic theory, same thing. So psychoanalysis, psychodynamic, that's one overarching perspective of psychology. People still do that today. In fact, I've been to a psychodynamic-oriented therapist when I've gone to a therapist. I've been to one of those and a few others, but it's mostly today people that care a lot about your past, and they are trying to draw things out of you. But Freud, who started psychoanalysis, cares about the unconscious. The unconscious are the deep-seated thoughts that you have that supposedly influence all of your thoughts and behaviors. So he said, he used the analysis of the metaphor of an iceberg. So an iceberg is mostly underwater because it floats on water, but the majority of the mass of an iceberg is underwater. He said, like our mind. So the iceberg part that's above the water is the conscious, and the part that's underwater is the preconscious and the unconscious. But that actually makes up more of the iceberg. And he said that's like our mind, where the part of our mind that we're actually consciously thinking about is a relatively less important part than the stuff that actually controls our behavior, according to Freud. That is the unconscious part, the things that influence our behavior that we're not even aware of. Like if your complexes, if your father didn't give you enough love, and you try and overcompensate by being successful in your job, or by trying to amass a lot of romantic partners or whatever, to try and unconsciously prove to yourself that you have worth or something like that. That would be a very psychoanalytic thing to believe. But basically it's unconscious, and it started by Sigmund Freud. After that came behaviorism. Also Freud, very much concerned about your upbringing when you were very young. Behaviorism after that in the 1920s. Behaviorism is a study of observable behavior. They put that on there on purpose, definitely, because they said that's fine that Freud wants to say that the unconscious is the most important part, but your unconscious is unconscious, and so it's not even measurable, really. And so how could that be science? Because science needs to study what you can actually put into a number. And so that's what they cared about. Behaviorism was about actions and reactions. It's about if you do this thing to somebody, how do they react? The major behaviorists are, John Watson, Skinner, Pavlov. Pavlov's the guy with the dog. He started classical conditioning. He's the one that said if I found the guy with the dog that would give the dog food, the dog salivated, but then he wondered if he could ring a bell before giving the dog food, and the dog would salivate to the bell. So he's adding the stimulus to a dog and modifying the dog's behavior as a result of the stimulus of a bell and food. It's behavior modification as a result of stimulus. So it's very like robotic, and modifying behavior using behavioral modification techniques. And then there's Skinner, who modified the behavior of pigeons using different types of reinforcement. And we'll talk about this more, but it's the grid of positive and negative reinforcement, and then, positive and negative reinforcement and punishment. And it's what can you, like if you yell at a dog, that would be positive punishment, that kind of thing. So that's also behavioral modification. And then John Watson was the guy who had a quote about infants. He said, "Give me any baby, basically, and I'll make it anything I want to do under the right circumstances." And he also is the one that scared the baby. He showed that a baby was not afraid of a white rat. We watched that video. And then he clung a loud gong and scared the baby and paired that with the rat using classical conditioning and made the baby afraid of the rat. So that's those two. There's, in the 1960s, as a reaction to both of those, there's humanistic psychology, which said, so psychoanalysis is pretty creepy. One, it's like super sexual, which it was with Freud, and very violent. I didn't reference either of those things, but it definitely was both those things. Very dark. And it's super deterministic. Freud said that by the time you're 6 years old, you are the way that you are, and you can't really change. And humanists definitely don't like that. They like to say that we're all improvable. It's like the hippie psychologists. And then they didn't like behaviorism also because it was too robotic. They like to think of humans as these like autonomous beings that can change themselves, and behaviorists tend to think of humans as deterministic robots where you can modify the behavior if you do the right thing. So humanists don't like either of those. They like the emphasis I have written down here, emphasis on doing good and self-improvement. The goal of life, the humanists, that pyramid that I actually don't think is on the wall right now, but it used to be on the wall for lots of years until I moved rooms, is the hierarchy of needs. At the top of the hierarchy of needs is self-actualization, which is the point of life, basically, is to become the best version of yourself that you can be. It's a focus on self-improvement. We don't really care what you did in your past in terms of how your dad raised you or whatever, how your mom neglected you or something like that. But we care about what you can do now and becoming the best version of yourself that you can be. And the other fields of psychology I have here are cognitive neuroscience, evolutionary, cognitive, and sociocultural. Cognitive neuroscience is the study of brain anatomy, and that would be anything biological, like how your level of serotonin can influence your mood, or how the function of the amygdala can deal with aggression, anything like that. Evolutionary is a relatively new field of psychology, kind of theoretical, not so much objective as much as the other fields, but it's about how humans have adapted and evolved over time. So it can even be things like how are males and females different as a result of the evolutionary process. Cognitive psychology is how we remember and learn, but specifically it's how we think about things, which sounds like all kinds of psychology, but it's in therapy, the cognitive part of like obsessive compulsive disorder therapy would be thinking about things in a productive and rational way rather than like over dramatizing things. If you're afraid of getting sick, a cognitive therapist might say, well, what are you afraid of happening if you don't wash your hands? And you'd say like, well, maybe at an emotional level you might think this like catastrophic thing is going to happen, like you'll get Ebola or you'll die. And then the therapist would walk you through like, no, but what's actually going to happen? And you'd walk your cognitions, your thoughts, down to a realistic level. And then sociocultural is how society influences us, and that would be like differences between American and Mexican or Canadian norms, or Eastern and Western European norms, or how the norms differ between males and females, or how upper income or lower income families do things differently, or anything like that, but how society influences us. And that's pretty much wraps up in an extremely quick way the first half of today. Let's move on to a psychological experiment. So at the most basic level, a psychological experiment, as opposed to, there's a lot of different kinds of experiments, by the way, In social psychology, you can do lots of experiments, although the word experiment would be wrong, but there's lots of kinds of studies you can do. Let me move myself back over. In social psychology, you could do like a survey. That's not an experiment. You could do naturalistic observation. That's not an experiment. Naturalistic observation would be observing people. So that would be observing parents with their kids in Walmart, or observing Mr. Epps when he watches the lunch during lunch at McGinnis. That would all be naturalistic observation. And you can even conduct research doing that, but that's not an experiment. Here's what an experiment is. An experiment, at its most basic level, which is what we deal with, especially in AP Psych here, is going to be two groups with one difference between the two groups. So let's see, what could we do? That would be like if we're studying the difference between having a review sheet and not having a review sheet on test scores. That would be a perfectly fine experiment. And it's getting a data set where only one thing has been done differently between two groups of people, and then comparing those two sets of data. That's it. It's extremely simple, but very powerful. This is extremely important to understand. A psychological experiment is the only way to determine causality. If you have two things that are correlated, that does not necessarily mean that one causes the other. Income. In low-income areas, crime rate and household income. If you go to areas of the city which have lower average incomes, so go to areas of Oklahoma City where the neighborhoods have a very low average income, your crime rate's going to be much higher. Your incarceration rate, a lot of variables are going to be very different in low-income areas and high-income areas. So if you go to Nichols Hills, Gaillardia, high-income areas, your crime rate is going to be much lower. Does that then mean this correlation between income and crime? Does that mean that having money causes you to commit less crimes? Maybe, but you can't say that. You can't say that unless an experiment has been done. And here's an experiment. An experiment is you take two groups of people, you randomly assign them to two different conditions, and you do one thing and only one thing different in the two groups. So here's an experiment. One group gets a review sheet and one group doesn't get a review sheet. So let's put some fake numbers in here with a review sheet, and then I split my class in half. It's a 20-person class, and I give 10 people some sort of like a Quizlet review or something, and I give 10 people no review. I just say there's a quiz tomorrow, figure it out. And then I get these results. All right, so I get that, which is an average of 79. And then I have no sheet. I'm going to try and make this slightly worse, but not worse enough that it would get a significant result. And we'll talk about what the word significant means. And this should all sound very familiar to everybody that's in here. So 70, 80, 80, 70, 90, 80, whoops, not 8, 60, 70, 50, 80. I'm guessing this is going to have a lower average. Great, it does. So 79 versus 73. I'm going to write some stuff that you don't need to know here. Whoa, come on, mouse. Not paired. Yes, okay. This is what's called a t-test, and it gives a p-value. Don't worry about t-test, do worry about p-value. P-value is extremely important. And p-value is a significance value. And that is a mathematical or statistical measure. This is the number of whether or not your results are significant. And in normal English, the word significant means important. So like how important are the results? That's not what this means. So let me ask you this. Did having a review sheet help? It seems to have helped because the average was 79 instead of 73. So people with no sheet got a lower score, but people with a review sheet got a higher score. However, are these numbers close enough together that it could have been the case that this was an accident, that it wasn't actually the lack of a review sheet, it's just these people happen to accidentally get lower scores and these people happen to accidentally get higher scores? And it, just by looking at it, it looks like, yeah, that could have happened. Like these, it's not drastically different. Having a review sheet didn't like hugely improve people's scores. And so what this number is, and in any study, they'll give you a p-value. And the p-value, if p is less than 0.05, then it's significant. If p is greater than 0.05, it is not significant. So our p-value, and I'm going to modify these numbers to change the p-value here. This is very important to get. I love this stuff, but some people find it boring, but hang on here. The p-value in this case is 0.23, which is a bigger number than 0.05. So in this case, it would be not significant. Significance is a mathematical measure of the likelihood that your results are due to chance. In this case, there's a 23% chance that the difference between these two sets of numbers is because of luck. We want the odds of it being just a luck thing to be very, very low. And important people said that the threshold for that to be significant is 5%. So we want our p-value to hit 5% or better, which means lower. So on the review sheet, let's make this person, instead of an 80, let's give him a 90. Once I press enter, that's going to make this number, the 79, increase, making the difference between these two groups bigger, making the review sheet help more. And is that, think to yourself, is that going to make the p-value go up or down? It's going to make it go down, which it did. It moved from 0.23 to 0.17, making it closer to significant. It's still not significant. Let's make this person that didn't get a review sheet, instead of getting a 90, let's give them a 60. So that then pushes, because now we're making the review sheet even better and no review sheet even worse, which makes it less and less likely that someone did that bad with no sheet and that good with a review sheet just accidentally. It is now 95%, which is the inverse of the p-value, likely that the difference between these two groups is because of what we did, the independent variable, and not because of just random luck or chance. So the p-value is the odds that your results are due to chance. And in this case, it would be significant. Let's make this person get 100. Let's make this person get an 80. This person got 100. This person got a 90. Great. So now we have a p-value of 0.01. So the review sheet, if you got a review sheet, your average score would have been an 85, and if you didn't get a review sheet, your average score would have been a 70. There's a huge difference between getting a review sheet now and getting no review sheet. So it seems like there's definitely an impact in getting the review sheet or not getting the review sheet, and that's reflected in this p-value, which goes down and down, meaning that it is less and less likely that these differences are due to chance and more likely that it is due to what we did in the experiment. So it is significant, meaning it is not chance. All right, enough of that. The independent variable is what you manipulate. So in this, let me do a little side screen here. So in this case, the independent variable is the sheet. It is what's different between this group and this group. That's the independent variable. The dependent variable is what you're measuring. So that is the score on whatever test we took here. The experimental group is, you don't always have you do always have an experimental group. You don't always have a control group, which I don't even have here. Experimental group is the group that gets a manipulation. Here, this is a control group. This group we didn't do anything to this group. This group got a review sheet. So this would be in our experimental group, and this would be our control group. If we had done review sheet versus practice test, then that would be two experimental groups with no control group. But since we had a group that didn't do anything, that would be a control group. Blinds. Blinds are also very important. you can have single blind, double blind, or not blind. Blind is who knows about the purpose of the experiment before the experiment. Single blind, if I have a 20-person psychology class and I say, we're going to run an experiment, I'm going to give the left half of the class a review sheet, the right half of the class no review sheet. First of all, you'd be really mad at me. Second of all, that would be not blind, because I just told all of you the purpose of the experiment before it even started. That's generally almost always a bad thing, because now your results could be because if someone who wasn't given a sheet, maybe they'll just stop trying, maybe they'll try more, doesn't matter, but it influences how good they're going to do. So you don't want your subjects to know what the experiment is. Single blind is if your subjects don't know the purpose of the experiment, but you still do as the experimenter. So that would be if I secretly gave the left half of the room a review sheet, the right half of the room no review sheet, did the experiment. They don't know what's going on. Single blind. Double blind is if, as the experimenter, you don't even know who gets what. And that would be done by, I give everybody in the class a piece of paper and it's randomized whether that has review instructions or no instructions. So I don't even know if you got a review sheet or not. And that's a little bit better even than single blind, because now I can't have a bias. Confound is very important, and I wouldn't be terribly surprised if that was on the AP test. And it's kind of complicated. Well, it's not true. It's not that complicated, but you don't know it inherently. Confound is a way that the groups are different other than your independent variable. It's a bad thing. Confound, bad. A confound in this case would be like if, this would be a terrible confound. If I picked all of my review sheet people from AP Psych and all of my no sheet people from regular Psych. So now I have two possible explanations of why the review sheet people did better. It could be because they got a review sheet, which is definitely a possibility. Or it could be that they're AP students, so you would kind of expect them to be better at psychology than regular Psych students. And then why did this group do worse? It could be because they didn't get a sheet, or it could be because they're regular psychology students. That's a confound. So the way to fix a confound is to randomly assign people to conditions. Even doing left side of the room, right side of the room is a very small confound. I don't really know why the left side would inherently be better than the right side, but the best thing to do is to like flip a coin or do some random process to assign you get a review sheet, you don't get a review sheet. That's the best way to avoid a confound. Mean, median, mode, range. Mean is the average. That's what I did here. I just added up all these things equals. So I added up all these 10 numbers, which is 850. Then you divide by the number of numbers. It's just average, which is 85. Median is the middle number after sorting from lowest to greatest. And in this case, it apparently is 85. By the way, it's funny because 85 is not even in this number set. But so in the middle here, median is the middle number, but there isn't a middle number. There are two middle numbers, and it is 80 and 90. So in that case, you take the average or the mean of the two middle numbers, and that gives you 85. Mode is the most commonly occurring number. And just look at this number set. What is the mode? There are 270s, 380s, 390s, and 200s. So in this case, there would be two modes. It'd be 80 and 90, although I'm curious what Excel is going to say. It'll just say 80. I'm not sure why. But in reality, there are two modes because there are 380s and 390s. So the modes would be 80 and 90. The range is the difference between the smallest and the biggest number. So the difference between 80 and 70 is 30. Standard deviation is the average distance between a set of numbers. And here it's going to be 10. It's something like you take the mean, which is 85, and then you take each number's difference from the mean, and then something about that. But it's if your numbers are very clustered together, you'll have a low standard deviation, and if they're very far apart, you'll have a bigger standard deviation. Like if I make these two numbers 70, we're going to get a smaller standard deviation. Especially if I make them 80, we'll get an even smaller standard deviation. Because everything gets closer. And if I make every number 80, I think our standard deviation would be 0. Yep, because there's no deviation in the numbers. Correlation is a number of relationship between two sets of variables. First of all, it's important to say correlation does not imply causation. Just because two things are related does not mean one causes the other. That's super important. Second, correlation would be like GPA and ACT score. So do you think there's a positive correlation between GPA and ACT score? There probably is. Are there some people that have a really bad GPA, so they do really bad in school, but they get a really good ACT score? Sure. Are there people that do really well in school and get a bad ACT score? Probably also yes. But for the most part, people that do well in school tend to do well on the ACT as well. And that's a positive correlation. Correlation scores are measured in Pearson's R. I assume some guy named Pearson came up with it. And they range from R equals 1 is a perfect positive correlation, R equals -1 is a perfect negative correlation, and R equals 0 is no correlation at all. You can't have a correlation greater than 1 or less than -1. 1 would be a perfect positive correlation. Like if you correlated your height in inches compared to your height in centimeters, that would be a correlation score of 1, because as your height goes up in inches, it's going to go up by the exact same percentage in centimeters, because they're the same thing measured differently. And like an R score of 0.6 would be a fairly strong correlation. R score of 0.2 would be a very weak correlation. An R score of -0.7 would be a very strong negative correlation, and so on. Hindsight bias is things seem really obvious in hindsight. Like right now, as of April 15th, Corona seems like it was a lot less dramatic than people were saying it was going to be. At first, they were saying maybe there's going to be millions of deaths. Then people were saying 100 to 200,000 deaths. Then they downgraded that to 80,000 deaths and 60,000 deaths. And so it's tempting to say like, yeah, of course, I knew it, that Corona wasn't going to be that big a deal because all these other things like the swine flu, Ebola, none of those amounted to anything. So yeah, everyone should have known that Corona wasn't going to be as big as people thought. And that's hindsight bias. It's easy to say with hindsight that you knew better or something like that. Or if someone ends up doing bad, it's easy to say like, yeah, I knew that guy was going to fail for that thing. Theory is based on evidence, and hypothesis is just your guess. Hypothesis can be anything. I have a hypothesis that the coronavirus peak is going to be in 3 days from now. That's fine. You can have that hypothesis. You can't have that theory because theory has to be based on data. Operational definition is defining a dependent variable. If you want to find the effect of like being around people on happiness, so the effect of human interaction on happiness, that's fine. You could do that experiment, but you'd have to operationally define happiness. And what that means is you need to try to find a way to measure happiness that it gets it into a number, because you can't just put like happiness onto a chart with smiley faces. You have to have a number in order for it to be quantified. So how do you define happiness? And you could say it's the number of times people smile in a minute. That's fine. It's kind of a weird way, but sure, that gets it into a number. That's an operational definition. You could take someone's blood and measure the serotonin levels. That's super creepy, but sure, you can do that. That gets it into a number. You can say, give people a scale of 0 to 10 and say, how happy are you? That's fine. That's a great way to do happiness. Those are all operational definitions. Replication is good. You want to do an experiment over and over and over and over, because doing an experiment one time, you could get a fluke. I mean, p-values mean that you want at least a 5% or less chance that your results were due to chance, but that means there's a 5% chance that your results were due to chance. So it is possible that you can do a study, get a significant result, but it was an accident by its very definition. Case study is doing only a small group of people, which could be necessary in some cases. If your experiment would be very expensive, you might only want to study 2 people. If it's a rare form of cancer, you might only have 2 people that have that kind of cancer that are willing to do your study. Scatterplot is a way to measure correlations. And so if the y-axis is GPA and the x-axis is ACT score, then a scatterplot would look like this. So here's a person that got a really high GPA and ACT. Here's a person that got a high GPA but like a medium ACT score. Here's a person that got a medium. Here's a person that did bad on both. Here's a person that got a pretty good GPA but a really bad ACT score. Here's a person that got a fairly decent both. Here's a person that got a not great both. And the average line goes like that. That's a scatter plot. So it's a collection of data points graphed on an XY grid in 2 dimensions. Placebo effect is what you want to avoid for confounds. When you think something is going to happen, you unconsciously kind of make it happen. That's if I gave you... There was an episode of Freaks and Geeks, which is a fantastic show that was canceled, unfortunately, But one of the episodes in that show is the younger siblings in the show find out the older siblings are wanting to throw an alcoholic keg party, and they don't want them to because they know that's bad. So instead, they get a keg of non-alcoholic beer, and they give it to everyone at the party. They replace the kegs with this non-alcoholic keg, and everyone that starts drinking the beer with no alcohol starts acting like they're inebriated. And so that in that case would be placebo beer. Because those people are thinking it's alcoholic beer, they are acting like it would be alcoholic beer. Outlier is a number that greatly affects your results. Like if this person didn't take the test, that would really affect our results in a bad way. Anyway, that would be an outlier. That person didn't take it, I gave them a 0, and then that would kind of throw off the experimental results. But a number that falls far outside of our range, and actually the official ruling kind of is that if it falls within 2 standard deviations of your number set, you can throw it out of your data set. Meta-analysis is a study of studies. So that is, if you want to find out the effect of Tylenol on reducing headaches, you can look at one study, but there's also a thing called a meta-analysis, which is it looks at like 70 studies of Tylenol, Advil, and headaches, and it treats each study like a subject in a meta-study. It just looks at every study and makes like a compilation study. And that's it. So that's Unit 1.